Most women assume men notice the obvious: appearance, confidence, charm. But what men actually notice is far quieter. They notice how safe they feel around you. They notice your tone when you're tired. They notice how you react when they're unsure, not strong, not impressive. Men rarely talk about these things because they don't need to. They feel them. And today, we're going to explain 7 things men notice about women that most women never realize, but that quietly determine whether a man stays or slowly pulls away. When we talk about attraction, especially from a male perspective, there's a tendency to reduce it to surface-level traits. Physical beauty, style, youth, confidence, these things dominate the conversation because they're easy to point to and easy to measure. But that framing misses something far more fundamental, something men notice instinctively, often without having language for it: emotional consistency, not perfection, not constant positivity. Consistency. What men respond to most deeply over time is not how impressive a woman looks at her best, but how predictable her emotional presence is across ordinary, unfiltered moments. How she reacts when things don't go her way, how she speaks when she's tired, how she handles frustration, disappointment, or boredom. These moments don't make it into highlight reels, but they form the psychological environment of a relationship. And men are constantly assessing that environment because it directly affects their sense of safety and stability. From a psychological standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. Men are often socialized to manage stress internally, to be functional under pressure, and to suppress emotional volatility in order to perform. Because of that, they are acutely sensitive to emotional fluctuations in their close environment. Not necessarily because they're fragile, but because instability is costly. Emotional chaos drains cognitive energy. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes it harder to focus, to plan, and to commit. So when a man notices that a woman's emotional state swings dramatically based on minor external factors, attention, validation, inconvenience, mood, his nervous system registers that as risk. Not consciously at first, he may not articulate it, but he feels it. Conversations start to feel heavier. Silence starts to feel dangerous. He becomes more cautious with what he shares, not because he doesn't care, but because he's trying to avoid triggering an unpredictable response. This is where the idea of how you make him feel becomes more precise. It's not about making him feel constantly happy or entertained. It's about making him feel regulated, calm, or at the very least, not emotionally ambushed. Emotional consistency tells a man, I know what I'm walking into when I'm with you, and that predictability is profoundly attractive because it allows him to relax. Philosophically, this ties into something much older than modern dating advice. Human beings have always sought stability in their closest bonds. In uncertain environments, the ability to rely on another person's temperament becomes a survival advantage. You can tolerate external chaos if your inner circle is steady, but if the chaos is inside the relationship, there's nowhere to rest. Men may not describe it this way, but they are constantly scanning for whether a relationship feels like a refuge or another battlefield. This is also why emotional consistency often outweighs physical beauty over time. Beauty can draw attention, but it doesn't sustain peace. And peace is what allows attraction to deepen into attachment. A woman who is emotionally grounded, who doesn't overreact to every stressor, who can tolerate discomfort without turning it into conflict, slowly becomes invaluable. Not because she's flawless, but because she's reliable. It's important to clarify that emotional consistency does not mean emotional suppression. Men do not want women who feel nothing, express nothing, or never challenge them. What they notice and respect is emotional regulation. The ability to experience emotion without being consumed by it, to communicate dissatisfaction without escalation, to disagree without destabilizing the entire connection. From a psychological lens, this reflects maturity. Emotional maturity is the capacity to respond rather than react, to pause before speaking, to separate the present moment from accumulated resentment. Men notice this because it changes the entire tone of interaction. Conflict becomes manageable instead of threatening. Differences become negotiable instead of explosive. And here's the subtle part. Men often compare this unconsciously, not necessarily between women, but between emotional states. They notice how they feel before and after spending time with someone. Energized or depleted, clear-headed or anxious, motivated or distracted. Over time, these patterns become impossible to ignore. If a relationship consistently leaves him drained, he will begin to associate the woman, not intentionally, but neurologically, with stress. This is where emotional consistency intersects with attraction in a very practical way. A man who feels emotionally safe is more likely to be open, more likely to invest, more likely to plan for the future. Safety lowers defenses, and when defenses drop, intimacy grows. There's also a deeper philosophical dimension here related to identity and self-respect. A woman who is emotionally consistent is often someone who has a stable sense of self. She doesn't outsource her emotional regulation to others. She doesn't require constant reassurance to feel secure. That independence is deeply attractive because it signals strength without aggression, confidence without domination. Men notice this because it changes the power dynamics of the relationship. Instead of feeling responsible for managing her emotional world, he feels invited into it. There's a difference between partnership and caretaking. Emotional inconsistency can push a relationship toward the latter, where the man feels like he's constantly trying to prevent emotional fallout. That role is exhausting, and it erodes attraction over time. Conversely, emotional consistency allows admiration to grow. Men admire women who can remain composed under pressure, who can handle criticism without collapsing, who can face uncertainty without panic, not because they expect perfection, but because those traits mirror qualities they value in themselves and in life more broadly: resilience, clarity, and strength. It's also worth addressing a common misconception. Emotional consistency doesn't mean you never have bad days or emotional reactions. Men understand stress. They understand frustration. What they notice is whether those emotions are contextual or habitual. A bad day is human. A constant emotional storm becomes a pattern. And patterns shape perception. In relationships, patterns become predictions. If a man learns that every disagreement leads to emotional escalation, he will start avoiding disagreement altogether. Ether, not out of apathy, but out of self-preservation. And avoidance is often misinterpreted as emotional distance, when in reality, it's a response to instability. When emotional consistency is present, the opposite happens. Communication becomes easier. Silence becomes neutral instead of threatening. Space becomes restorative instead of punitive. These small shifts accumulate into something powerful, trust, and trust is the foundation upon which long-term attraction is built. From a philosophical perspective, there's something deeply ethical about this. Emotional consistency reflects responsibility, not just for one's actions, but for one's internal state. It's the recognition that while emotions are real, they are also manageable, that how we express them affects others, and that self-mastery is a form of respect. Men notice this respect, they feel it, and when a man feels respected at an emotional level, he becomes more generous, more protective, and more committed, not because he's being manipulated, but because the relationship feels like a place where he can be fully present without constantly bracing himself. So when we say men notice emotional consistency over physical perfection, we're really saying they notice the environment you create, the emotional climate you bring with you, whether your presence feels grounding or destabilizing, whether time with you feels like pressure or relief. And this isn't about changing who you are to appeal to someone else. It's about understanding the impact of emotional habits, about recognizing that attraction isn't just visual or verbal, it's experiential. It's how someone feels in your presence over time. If there's one thing to reflect on here, it's this: attraction grows where emotional safety exists. And emotional safety is built quietly and consistently through how you handle yourself when nothing is going perfect. That's what men notice long after first impressions fade, and that's where real connection begins. When people talk about respect in relationships, they often imagine something public and visible, compliments in front of others, social media praise, gestures that signal status. But what men notice most isn't what happens when an audience is present. It's what happens when no one is watching. The private moments, the small interactions that seem insignificant on the surface but quietly define the emotional structure of the relationship. Men are acutely sensitive to how they are treated in private because that's where truth tends to emerge. Public behavior can be curated. Private behavior is harder to fake. Tone, timing, facial expressions, eye contact, or the lack of it, These details communicate far more than words ever could, and men register them constantly, often without consciously analyzing them. Psychologically, this makes sense. Close relationships operate on implicit signals. We don't just listen to what someone says, we track how they say it, when they say it, and what emotional weight accompanies it. A simple sentence can feel supportive or dismissive depending on tone alone. Men may not always articulate these distinctions, but they feel the difference immediately. One of the most overlooked aspects of respect is tone. Not volume, not language, but tone. The difference between speaking to someone and speaking at them. Men notice whether a woman's voice softens or sharpens in moments of disagreement, whether questions are genuine or loaded with accusation, whether correction comes with curiosity or contempt. Contempt, in particular, is devastating. Even subtle forms of it, eye-rolling sighs, sarcasm, are deeply felt. Philosophically, contempt signals moral superiority. It says, I am above you. And once that message enters a relationship, it begins to seep or erode trust almost immediately. Men may tolerate it for a while, especially if they're invested, but attraction erodes quietly in its presence. Respect, on the other hand, is communicated through restraint, through choosing not to weaponize information, through speaking honestly without humiliating, through disagreement that doesn't turn into character assassination. Men notice when a woman protects their dignity in private, especially during conflict. That protection creates loyalty because it signals that the relationship is a safe place, not a courtroom. There's also something deeply psychological about how men experience respect in intimate relationships. For many men, respect is closely tied to identity. It's not just about ego, it's about worth. Feeling respected by a partner reinforces a man's sense of competence and agency. Feeling disrespected undermines it. And because romantic relationships are emotionally significant, their impact is magnified. This is why men notice how women speak about them when they're not present. Even small comments, jokes, complaints, dismissive remarks carry weight. Men may not hear every word, but they sense the underlying attitude, and attitude shapes behavior. A woman who respects her partner privately tends to support him instinctively. A woman who doesn't often undermines him without realizing it. Respect also shows up in listening. Men notice whether they're interrupted, corrected mid-sentence, or rushed through thoughts. They notice whether their concerns are acknowledged or minimized. Being heard is a form of respect because it communicates that one's internal world matters. And when a man feels that his thoughts are taken seriously, he becomes more willing to share them. From a philosophical perspective, respect is rooted in recognition, the acknowledgement that another person is a sovereign individual with their own perspective and values. When a woman treats a man as someone to be managed or improved rather than understood, respect erodes. Men notice when conversations feel instructional instead of collaborative, when guidance turns into control. This doesn't mean men reject influence or feedback. What they notice is the posture behind it. Advice offered with humility feels supportive. Advice delivered with superiority feels dismissive. The same words can land very differently depending on intent. And intent is often revealed in private moments, not public ones. There is also a subtle but important distinction between criticism and contempt. Criticism targets behavior. Contempt targets character. Men are generally open to feedback about what they do. They shut down when feedback becomes a statement about who they are. Private conversations that drift into contempt, even unintentionally, leave lasting impressions. Men also notice consistency. A woman who is warm and respectful in public but cold or dismissive in private creates confusion. That inconsistency signals instability. It raises questions about authenticity. Respect that only exists when others are watching doesn't feel real. And men are remarkably sensitive to that discrepancy. Psychologically, private respect builds trust because it reduces the need for vigilance. A man who trusts that his partner won't belittle him behind closed doors can relax. He doesn't have to perform. He doesn't have to defend himself constantly. That relaxation deepens intimacy because it allows him to be more fully present. There's another layer to this that often goes unnoticed: how women handle a man's weaknesses in private. Men notice whether their vulnerabilities are protected or exploited, whether mistakes are treated as learning opportunities or ammunition, whether moments of uncertainty are met with patience or frustration. When a woman responds to a man's vulnerability With respect, something powerful happens. The relationship moves from surface level connection to genuine intimacy. Respect in these moments signals emotional intelligence. It communicates that strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the ability to handle it without cruelty. Philosophically, this aligns with a deeper understanding of human dignity. Everyone has limitations, everyone fails. Respect is the decision not to define someone solely by their weakest moments. Men notice when a woman holds a broader view of them, one that includes flaws without reducing them to those flaws. It's also important to recognize that respect is not passive. It's active and intentional. It shows up in choosing words carefully, in pausing before reacting, in considering how something will land emotionally, not just whether it's true. Men notice that consideration because it feels like care. There is a tendency to assume that love alone sustains relationships. But love without respect becomes unstable, it turns emotional, volatile. Men may feel loved but not valued. And over time, that imbalance creates distance. Respect stabilizes love by grounding it in mutual recognition. In everyday life, this plays out in simple ways. How disagreements are handled late at night, how stress is managed after a long day, how requests are made, how boundaries are discussed. Men notice whether these interactions feel cooperative or adversarial, whether the relationship feels like a partnership or a power struggle. And perhaps most importantly, men notice whether respect is conditional, whether it disappears when expectations aren't met. Conditional respect feels transactional. It suggests that worth is earned rather than inherent. Men may comply for a while, but attraction diminishes under those conditions because the relationship stops feeling safe. When respect is consistent, especially in private, it creates a sense of mutual dignity. It allows both people to grow without fear of humiliation. It makes conflict productive instead of destructive. And it fosters a quiet confidence in the relationship that doesn't need external validation. So when we say men notice respect in small, private moments, what we're really saying is that they notice how you see them when no one else is looking. Whether your words build or erode, whether your tone invites or repels, whether your presence feels affirming or diminishing. And that leads to something worth reflecting on. Attraction isn't sustained by grand gestures, but by everyday decisions. The decision to speak with care, to listen without dismissing, to disagree without degrading. In the quiet moments, when no one is watching, you are always communicating value. And what you communicate there is what ultimately determines whether a man leans in or slowly pulls away. One of the least discussed yet most decisive moments in any relationship is how a woman responds when a man becomes vulnerable. Not dramatically vulnerable, not in a cinematic confession, but in subtle, often imperfect ways: hesitation, uncertainty, self-doubt, emotional fatigue. Men notice these moments with extreme clarity because vulnerability for them is not casual. It's costly. From a psychological perspective, men are often conditioned to equate vulnerability with risk. Many learn early on that emotional exposure can lead to rejection, loss of respect, or dismissal. As a result, when a man chooses to open up, even slightly, he is testing the emotional environment. He's asking, often unconsciously, is it safe here? And the answer he receives in that moment shapes his behavior long after the conversation ends. What's important to understand is that vulnerability doesn't always look like tears or explicit emoji. Ownal language. Sometimes it appears as withdrawal, sometimes as frustration, sometimes as a quiet admission of uncertainty. I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm struggling with this. Men notice immediately how these moments are handled because they reveal whether vulnerability is welcomed or penalized. If vulnerability is met with patience, curiosity, or simple presence, something shifts internally. The man learns that he doesn't have to perform strength at all times to be accepted, that his value isn't conditional on competence alone. This creates psychological safety, which is the foundation of genuine intimacy. But if vulnerability is met with criticism, impatience, comparison, or subtle contempt, the impact is profound. Even a small dismissive reaction, changing the subject, minimizing the feeling, offering unsolicited solutions too quickly, can register as rejection. Men may not confront it directly. Instead, they adapt. They become quieter, more guarded, less emotionally available. Not because they don't care, but because they've learned that openness carries a cost. Philosophically, vulnerability is an act of trust. It assumes goodwill in the other person. When that trust is broken, even unintentionally, It reshapes the relationship dynamic. Men often respond by reinforcing emotional boundaries. They become more self-contained, less expressive, and while the relationship may continue functionally, something essential is lost. This is where many misunderstandings arise. Women may perceive a man's emotional withdrawal as indifference or lack of depth. In reality, it is often a protective response, a recalibration based on previous experience. Men remember how vulnerability was received, even if they never speak about it again. There's also a cultural layer to this. Men are frequently told, explicitly or implicitly, that their worth is tied to strength, compete, NCE, and emotional control. When a woman responds negatively to vulnerability, it reinforces that narrative. It confirms the belief that emotional openness is a liability rather than a strength. Conversely, when vulnerability is respected, it challenges that belief. It creates space for a more integrated sense of self, where strength and openness can coexist. Men notice this deeply because it feels rare, and rarity increases value. Another subtle point here is timing. Men often open up gradually, testing the waters with small disclosures before sharing something more significant. They notice whether those early disclosures are handled with care. If the response feels safe, they may go deeper. If not, they retreat. This process is often unconscious, but it's consistent. From a psychological standpoint, this mirrors attachment dynamics. Secure attachment grows when emotional bids are met with responsiveness. Insecure attachment grows when bids are ignored or punished. Men notice patterns in how their emotional signals are received, and they adjust accordingly. It's also important to differentiate between emotional support and emotional takeover. Men notice whether their vulnerability is allowed to exist without being immediately managed. Sometimes the most respectful response is simply listening, allowing space without fixing, acknowledging without judgment. This communicates trust in the man's capacity to navigate his own experience. When vulnerability is met with overcorrection, advice, solutions, comparisons, it can feel invalidating, not because the intention is bad, but because it bypasses the emotional moment. Men notice when their inner world is rushed past rather than understood. Philosophically, this touches on a deeper human need to be seen, not corrected, not improved, seen. Vulnerability is an invitation into someone's internal landscape. How that invitation is handled determines whether the door stays open. Men also notice whether vulnerability is later used against them. This is critical. If something shared in trust becomes ammunition in a future argument, the damage is long-lasting. Trust collapses. Emotional openness becomes dangerous. Men may continue to communicate, but they will filter carefully. They will avoid sharing anything that could be weaponized. This isn't about keeping score or avoiding accountability. It's about understanding the sacred nature of vulnerability. Philosophically, to betray someone's vulnerability is to betray their trust. Men notice this breach deeply, and it alters the emotional contract of the relationship. There's another layer worth exploring: how vulnerability affects attraction. Contrary to popular belief, vulnerability does not inherently reduce attraction for men or women. What reduces attraction is vulnerability met with disrespect. When a woman responds with empathy and steadiness, vulnerability can actually deepen attraction because it creates authenticity and emotional resonance. Men feel more connected when they can be honest. They feel more invested when they are accepted fully. This acceptance doesn't mean agreement or indulgence. It means respect. It means recognizing vulnerability as part of the human condition, not as a flaw. Psychologically, this also relates to emotional leadership. A woman who can hold space for vulnerability without becoming overwhelmed demonstrates emotional strength. Men notice this because it signals stability. It shows that the relationship can handle depth, not just surface-level interaction. There's also an existential dimension here. Vulnerability often arises around questions of purpose, failure, uncertainty, or meaning. When a man shares these concerns, he is revealing his inner struggle with identity and direction. How this is received shapes not only the relationship, but his sense of self within it. If vulnerability is dismissed, he may conclude that those parts of himself are unwelcome. If it's respected, he learns that he doesn't have to fragment himself to maintain connection. That wholeness is allowed. In practical terms, this shows up in everyday moments. A man admitting stress at work, expressing doubt about a decision, acknowledging emotional exhaustion. Men notice whether these admissions are met with patience or pressure, whether they're allowed to exist without immediately needing to man up. This doesn't mean men want to remain in vulnerability indefinitely. Most want to resolve, to act, to move forward. But they notice whether the process is respected, whether vulnerability is treated as a phase, not a failure. Over time, the cumulative effect of these moments shapes the emotional depth of the relationship. A man who feels safe being vulnerable becomes more expressive, more engaged, more emotionally present. A man who doesn't becomes distant, not emotionally absent, but emotionally protected. So when we say men notice how women react to their vulnerability, what we're really saying is that they notice whether it's safe to be human around you, whether strength is the only acceptable currency, or whether honesty is allowed too. And that leads to a final reflection we're sitting with. Intimacy doesn't grow from perfection, but from permission. Permission to be seen without fear of judgment. When vulnerability is met with respect, it becomes a bridge rather than a risk. And the way you respond in those quiet moments may determine not just how close a man feels to you, but whether he ever lets you see who he really is. As relationships deepen, men become less focused on isolated traits and more attuned to patterns. Not just what happens, but how it feels to live inside the emotional rhythm of the relationship. Over time, one distinction becomes unmistakable: whether a woman brings peace or chaos into his life. This isn't about excitement versus boredom or passion versus calm. It's about emotional energy. And men notice it with remarkable clarity. Peace is often misunderstood. It's not silence. It's not passivity. And it's certainly not the absence of emotion. Peace is emotional coherence. It's the sense that interactions make sense, that reactions are proportionate, that problems don't escalate unnecessarily. Chaos, by contrast, is emotional unpredictability. Thank you. It's when small issues become large conflicts, when moods shift without explanation, when tension lingers without resolution. From a psychological standpoint, human beings are wired to seek environments that minimize unnecessary stress. Chronic stress taxes the nervous system. It reduces cognitive capacity, impairs decision-making, and erodes well-being. Men particularly are sensitive to this because many already carry significant external pressure from work, responsibility, and expectation. When the relationship itself becomes another source of volatility, it stops functioning as a refuge. Men may not describe it in these terms, but they constantly assess how a relationship affects their internal state. Do they feel calmer after spending time together, or more agitated? Do conversations leave them clearer or confused, energized or drained? These patterns accumulate into a felt sense, and that sense drives behavior more powerfully than logic ever could. Peaceful energy doesn't mean conflict never occurs. It means conflict has boundaries. It begins somewhere, moves toward resolution, and ends. Chaos, on the other hand, has no clear edges. It resurfaces unexpectedly. It leaks into unrelated moments. It creates an atmosphere of emotional vigilance, where a man feels like he has to brace himself, never quite knowing what will trigger tension. Philosophically, this distinction mirrors an ancient idea that order is not the absence of complexity, but the ability to navigate complexity without collapse. A woman who brings peace is not one who avoids difficulty, but one who can face it without destabilizing herself or the relationship. Men notice this because it signals strength of character. There's also a subtle moral dimension here. Emotional chaos often involves a lack of accountability. Feelings become justification. Reactions become excuses. When emotional states are treated as uncontestable facts, dialogue becomes impossible. Men notice when there's no room for reason, no pause between feeling and action. Over time, this erodes respect. Peaceful energy, by contrast, includes self-awareness. It involves recognizing emotional states without being ruled by them. It allows for reflection, for repair. Men notice when a woman can say, "I was overwhelmed," instead of turning overwhelm into accusation. That ability changes everything. Another important factor is emotional recovery. Men notice how quickly or whether emotional equilibrium is restored after conflict. Does tension resolve and stay resolved, or does it linger, resurface, or get stored as resentment? Peace isn't about avoiding disruption, it's about restoring balance. Chaos resists closure. From a psychological perspective, unresolved emotional tension creates a background hum of stress. It keeps the nervous system activated. Men may not consciously connect this to the relationship at first, but their bodies do. They become less present, less affectionate, less inclined to engage deeply, not because they don't care, but because engagement feels costly. There's also the issue of emotional amplification. Men notice when emotions are intensified rather than processed, when frustration becomes outrage, when disappointment becomes personal attack. This escalation creates instability. It makes minor issues feel dangerous. And when everything feels dangerous, nothing feels safe. Peaceful energy communicates trust in the relationship's resilience. It says, we can handle this. Chaos says, this could fall apart at any moment. Men respond instinctively to that difference. Stability invites investment. Instability encourages caution. It's important to recognize that chaos isn't always loud. Sometimes it's subtle, passive aggression, emotional withdrawal, unspoken expectations. Men notice these patterns too. Silence can be just as destabilizing as conflict when it's used as punishment or control. Peace involves clarity. Even difficult truths spoken calmly are less stressful than ambiguity. Philosophically, peace reflects integration. An integrated person doesn't fragment under stress. They don't outsource emotional regulation. They don't require constant external validation to remain steady. Men notice this because it creates a sense of mutual adulthood. The relationship feels like two grounded individuals meeting, rather than one person carrying the emotional weight of both. Chaos often emerges when emotional needs are unmanaged, when insecurity drives behavior, when fear disguises itself as control. Men notice when emotional reactions are rooted in unresolved issues rather than present circumstances. Over time, this creates a feeling of being trapped in someone else's inner turmoil. Peaceful energy doesn't deny insecurity or fear, it contextualizes them. It allows for vulnerability without collapse. It creates space for growth. Men notice when a woman takes responsibility for her inner world rather than projecting it outward. That responsibility is deeply attractive because it signals maturity. There's also a long-term consideration here. Men think in terms of sustainability, even if they don't articulate it. They ask, often unconsciously, can I live like this? Not for a week, not for a month, but for years. Peace feels sustainable. Chaos does not. This is where the idea of drama becomes relevant. Drama is emotionally stimulating, but it's exhausting. It creates highs and lows. Tea can feel intense, but ultimately destabilize connection. Men may be drawn to intensity initially, but they don't build lives on it. Over time, intensity without stability becomes a liability. Peace, by contrast, allows for depth. It creates the conditions for trust, cooperation, and long-term planning. Men notice when a relationship supports their goals rather than competing with them. When emotional energy is aligned rather than constantly diverted. There's also an ethical component to this. Bringing peace into a relationship is an act of care. It's a choice to regulate oneself for the sake of the shared space. Chaos often prioritizes self-expression over mutual well-being. Peace balances both. Men notice when their presence is met with calm rather than tension, when problems are approached collaboratively rather than adversarially, when emotional states are communicated rather than imposed. These experiences shape how safe and valued they feel. It's worth emphasizing that peace is not weakness. It requires strength to remain composed under stress, to listen without reacting defensively, to de-escalate rather than dominate. Men notice this strength because it mirrors qualities they admire: discipline, restraint, clarity. Over time, the accumulation of peaceful moments creates something powerful: emotional trust, a sense that the relationship is a stable base rather than an additional challenge. Men become more open, more generous, more committed when they feel that stability. So when we say men notice peace versus chaos energy, we're really talking about the emotional footprint you leave behind, the residue of interaction. Whether your presence calms or agitates, whether life feels simpler or more complicated with you in it. And that leads to a final thought worth carrying forward. Attraction isn't just about how someone feels in moments of excitement, but how they feel in moments of rest. Peace isn't boring, it's rare. And in a world that constantly demands attention, stability, and performance, being a source of calm is one of the most valuable qualities you can offer. The question to reflect on is simple, but profound. When someone leaves your presence, do they feel more grounded or more unsettled? Because the answer to that question often determines whether they stay.